Hi, it's Jenny White with Restore Oklahoma Public Education, and today we're going to talk you through a presentation that we just gave which outlines the differences between traditional and progressive education. Common Core state standards are more in line with progressive forms of education, and it's very helpful for you to understand and know the difference so that you can determine what you have when your child brings home homework. And it is advisable every single day to check what your child brings home from school, go over that information with he or she, and make sure that you understand what's exactly coming from the classroom. So I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Okay, let's start out by talking a little bit about nomenclature. There are actually two terms, traditional and academic, and both apply to a traditional classical education. The others are transformational and progressive, and both of those terms are used synonymously to mean a newer form of education or a John Dewey form of education. So let's delineate a little bit between the two of those. What is an academic or traditional education? Well, the founders of this country wanted to make sure that every child had an opportunity to read and to be able to understand the form of government that they were passing down to them. And remember, a republic had never really been done before, and so this was something that was very new. They wanted to make sure that education was followed in order to transmit the knowledge and the skills and the understanding of the old generation that understood about the republic to the new generation so that they would have an opportunity to keep the republic that we had been given. It's based on the recitation and memorization of facts from textbooks, and then those facts then are used as a basis for higher order learning and critical thinking skills. And we hear a lot about how Common Core is going to cause critical thinking, and that's what we need to do, is have critical thinking skills. Well, the problem is you can't think about nothing. You can't think about air. You have to have some kind of a foundational knowledge in order to be able to build that knowledge on to be able to critically think. If we don't have those kinds of facts and we are not memorizing them and we don't understand them, then basically we are building a house upon sand, and eventually that house is going to fall over. We're not going to be prepared to understand knowledge and have knowledge. And then basically after we learn those facts, we use that knowledge to formulate reasoned conclusions. And it's important to understand that outcomes were neither required nor were they promised. Also, academic or traditional education didn't require every student to leave prepared for college. As if you weren't aware of it, we did not warehouse children in 12 grades up until about the last 50 years. It was the founders, for example, didn't even attend school after about the 8th grade, and then they all went on to either an apprenticeship or a college, something like that. Now, granted, yes, they were much better educated back then. An 8th grade education was certainly a postgraduate education in today's world, but that's what we did. We educated children for knowledge, not just to have them in class. And that knowledge then prepared all students for different tracks of life because you'd earned that knowledge, and then so you were able to take that earned knowledge and parlay that into a vocational, academic, or an arts field. It was state-centered, but it wasn't created by the state. It was created, public schools were created by churches or community organizations to fulfill the needs of that community, not the state, and certainly not the federal government. There were just simple cognitive tests that were given to make sure that kids were on task or to be able to pass them on to a next grade, nothing like we have today. Again, it was very important to understand that it was teacher-centered and directed. It wasn't group projects, it was teacher-centered. This is a new book, or this is a book that I just have recently gotten, a Thomas Jefferson Education. Very enlightening book, and I would suggest that if you're interested in classical education, you get this book. It's very easy to read, very small, and it explains basically what a classical education is. Well, it's reading classical books. It's reading Moby Dick. It's reading the Odyssey or the Iliad. It's not textbooks. It's classic books. You have mentors. You don't have professors. You don't sit in a class and listen to somebody drone on and on. You're the one who does the work, and then you just have a mentor that comes alongside to guide you, to tell you if you're doing things properly or not, or give you hints as to what to read. It inspires, it doesn't require, it structures time, it doesn't structure content. You should be able to, in a classical education, divulge into any area that you seem to really enjoy spending time in. Not just this today is math, we're doing this for 5 hours. I mean, we don't structure that time. It's simplistic, it's not complex, my goodness. That's a eye-opener right there. Of course, we have quality, not conformity. And what is Common Core State Standards but conformity, common? And here's kind of another eye-opener, if you will. This education that you're providing for your children is for you. It's not for them. You're actually going on this journey yourself to broaden your mind, to increase your knowledge, and you're bringing your children along. So instead of having perpetual 14-year-olds, which is what we seem to have today, because I think technology keeps them certainly in that little cocoon, but I also think we don't allow kids to take control of their own education. And I think if we were to do that, and we were to take control of our time and allow ourselves to become knowledgeable, we would bring our children along, and that would make for a more adult type, less juvenile education that would bring more knowledge. Okay, let's look at transformational and progressive education. You can see that I've got a little Earth Day sign here because progressive education literally believes that the purpose of education is to make radical changes in the nature of people, government, basic institutions. Basically, it's a change agent for society. That's what John Dewey had said. That's specifically what he said in a number of his books, is that education was to be the change agent for society. He wanted a better society. He wanted a socialistic society, and that's what education should do. It defines the purpose of education in terms of changing attitudes, of values, and the worldview of learners. It's student-centered instruction, hands-on activities, student-led discovery group activities, very project-based instruction, you'll note that there is quite a bit of that today. We have a lot of project-based instruction, and that's really not what we were looking for. And it's a very interesting kind of a situation. I was reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and I noticed on one page that Scout was going on and on about her education. She was educated primarily by Atticus, her dad, at home. He taught her how to read using the Wall Street Journal, and it was very frustrating for her to get to school and have the teacher say, no, you can't teach her anymore how to read. I will do that. That's my job. Well, that really frustrated her, and she didn't really much like school after that. And here's a comment that she made. The remainder of my school days were no more auspicious than the first. Indeed, they were an endless project that slowly evolved into a unit in which miles of construction paper and wax crayon were expended by the state of Alabama in its well-meaning but fruitless efforts to teach me group dynamics. What Jem called the Dewey Decimal System was school-wide by the end of my first year, so I had no chance to compare it with other teaching techniques. I could only look around me. Atticus and my uncle, who went to school at home, knew everything. Well, at least what one didn't know the other did. Furthermore, I couldn't help but noticing that my father had served for years in the state legislature, elected each time without opposition, innocent of the adjustments my teacher thought essential to the development of good citizenship. And I think it's interesting she says the Dewey Decimal System here. Well, that has to do with libraries, and that's not exactly what she was talking about. She was talking about the internment of Dewey-centered education in schools. If you recall, John Dewey created the Teachers College at Columbia University in New York and churned out teachers, and they made their way across the nation, starting in about the mid-20s and 30s. And, of course, To Kill a Mockingbird was supposed to be set in the 30s. And this is exactly what happened. They went out and took John Dewey's tenets into the world, and this is what you got. So what else about transformational education? Well, it's integrated interdisciplinary subjects or theme-based units, you heard Scout say, such as reading a story about cooking a meal and calculating the cost of food. Well, Significant attention is made to social development, including teamwork, and that includes team teaching. We have a lot of team teaching. We've thought about interdisciplinary subjects. So when I was teaching, for example, we wanted to have an interdisciplinary unit where whatever we were teaching in math needed to somehow apply in science or history and also in English. It takes a lot of time out of the classroom, doesn't really provide the kind of education. It sounds good, but it really needs to be, that time needs to be better spent and is better spent in the classroom, specifically studying a specific topic and not all over the board like that. It's important to understand that one of the tenets of progressive education is behavioral modification. And so there are actually surveys that are given out to kids. And this is a picture of one right here on this slide. It came from a school in Hugo, which had started had gotten a 21st century grant from the Federal Department of Education. Well, the 21st Century Skills initiative is very John Dewey centered. As a matter of fact, all their white papers discuss what John Dewey did and how important John Dewey's tenets were. So it's a very progressive form of education. And this particular grant, they were working with a psychologist's office in town and administering these surveys. They're very open-ended. I feel lucky because my friends say, my parents, blah. It's one of those things that you just don't want to have your kids doing. All right, what else? Well, students choose different kinds of classes according to their perceived abilities or career plans. So we're talking about workforce here. We're working towards educating kids. This is progressive education, educating kids toward finding a job. We're not educating them for knowledge so that they can determine what they want to be when they grow up, but we're educating them for a job. And you'll notice here's a picture of Oklahoma Governor Mary Fallin, who is now chairman of the National Governors Association, one of the one of the organizations that's pushing the Common Core along with the Council of Chief State School Officers, both private organizations not subject to Open Records Act, and with her chairmanship, Governor Fallin was allowed to create her own initiative. And so she created an education initiative, and here's what hers is. It's called the America Works Initiative. And just follow along here. The America Works Initiative aims to help close that gap, the achievement gap, by engaging education, business, and government leaders in a dialogue about what governors can do to more closely align K-12 education, universities, community and technical colleges, and workforce training providers with future labor demands. It will also marshal the resources of the NGA in supporting governors and their staffs in using data and information to identify states' future labor demands, prioritize changes in state education and workforce training systems, and take action to boost their workforces. We hope to provide a working roadmap for every state to align their educational outcomes with workforce needs. How many times do we say workforce? It's very important to understand that this is a very outcome-based education, school to work. Governor Clinton, President Clinton, provided us with the School to Work initiative, which was another one of those failed things that went by the wayside because it just doesn't work to educate kids into a job. And it's very important to understand here that it also does not promote economic growth, in the sense that when you have, it doesn't provide competition for businesses, because what ends up happening is you have a business that is given tax incentives in order to locate here, and then what ends up happening after this particular business has been given tax incentives, which aren't given to all businesses, so free enterprise doesn't work when we're meddling with it like this. Then we come along and the business says, well, we need some we need some people to be trained for our jobs. We're making widgets and we need to train these widget makers. Well, instead of just saying, well, you're a private company, you make money, go ahead and train your employees. We don't do that. We then have taxpayers pay for vocational education then to train employees for private businesses. And so this is where it comes in. Businesses come to the Chamber of Commerce and say, we need people to work in our widget factory. And the Chamber of Commerce then goes and talks to the Department of Education and says, well, we need to have widget people to make these widgets, or we're going to lose this business here, and then nobody will be able to get a job, and the state will have to put an out of business sign up. Well, all of this is tremendously silly, and again, we don't educate children for the workforce. We educate children to have knowledge, and then they can parlay that into whatever job they want. So that's a very upsetting situation. All right, so what are some similarities between outcome-based education and the Common Core? Well, student learning centers around social life or related problems, issues, and changes based on current events and future trends, not historical knowledge or facts. So, very concerning. Here we have Welcome to Social Justice High School, and here's a sweet little girl who's done a project on global warming. Again, a project, it's global warming. Anthropogenic global warming has never been proven, and yet we have kids in school that are being taught this. So what else? Outcomes are picked first, then the curriculum, instruction, and teaching methodologies are aligned to move the child to the desired outcome. And in this particular case, we're talking about conceptual understanding in this instance. So it's OBE seeks to reject a rank order definition of success by essentially promising that all students will perform as well as all other students on the high end of the bell curve, and no students will perform at the low end by setting one standard. Well, that's very fascinating, but it just doesn't work like that. No matter what you do, even if you give a kid a standardized test, you're going to have a bell-shaped curve. That's the way things work. But if you'll look here, this information comes from a book, Common Core Mathematics in a PLC at Work. This PLC is a professional learning community. This is team teaching, basically, is what this is. And this is a Common Core math book, and it's on Amazon. This is where I found this, and I found the parts on Amazon. You can go and look this up for yourself. It's important that it says here, if your team collaboratively writes the assessments and scoring rubrics with agreed on depth of knowledge expectation, then each member of the team shares an understanding of what is expected of students, and more important, the same performance level is expected of all third grade students, no matter which teacher the students are assigned. So there you go. It says it itself. Now, it goes on to say, equally important, by starting with the development of the assessments, all members of your team from the beginning know how students will be assessed. This, in turn, affects how you will teach. The assessments must focus on conceptual understanding. So what's the outcome here? Conceptual understanding, as the Common Core state standards require. And each teacher must know this in advance of teaching the lesson. The collaborative team commitment to using the common assessments and scoring rubrics in turn demands that daily mathematics instructions must also focus on conceptual understanding. So here you have a book out of real life being used in the classroom. It is a Common Core book, and it tells you exactly what I just said right there. That's outcome-based education, absolutely. All right, let's look at the next one here. Performance standards and grading rubrics are not based on traditional knowledge and skills, but higher order thinking skills and problem solving, sometimes even attitudes. Well, Phyllis Schlafly has studied education for years and years and years, and she was a big opponent of the outcome-based education movement when it sparked up in the 90s, and worked very hard to kill it. And she has something that I'm taking a quote out of Why the Schools Are Being Federalized that she wrote. And it says, according to OBE guru Bill Spady, the traditional subject-based curriculum disappears from OBE. OBE report cards substitute check marks for grades, focusing more on skills, attitudes, and behaviors instead of knowledge and skills. Okay? Well, if you look over here, again, this is from that Common Core Mathematics textbook. And if you'll look right here, it says, suppose you grade assessments and make report cards based on a 1 through 4 scale rubric. So this is specifically, we're using this to make sure that all kids are on the same level. So here is what your grade would be. Number 1 does not meet the standard. Number 2 approaches the standard. I don't know what that means. You walk forward toward the standard and stand there. I don't know what that means, approaches the standard. Masters the standard. Excels on the standard. So there you go. You'd get a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. It doesn't tell you how well you're doing in class at all. It doesn't give you any idea of what your actual knowledge level is, but it certainly puts everybody on the same end of the same level. All right, what about academic math versus transformational math? Well, in traditional math, the emphasis is on memorization of basic facts, such as the multiplication tables. 1 plus 2 is 2. One single answer is sought using a standard method. Mathematics after elementary grades is tracked with different students covering different levels of material. Not every child should have Algebra 2. It's not necessary. What is necessary is what is best for the child. Do they enjoy that Algebra 2? Are they actually capable of doing Algebra 2, or are they better off doing something else? Classical education is really very centered on the child. This is not at all. This is all centered on what's best for the group. And I would like to point out, too, that math is an absolute wrong or right. It's an absolute. It's a truth. 1 plus 1 equals 2 is always going to be true. You can't make 1 plus 1 equals 3. So in today's education world and today's world in general, we're trying so hard to get rid of truth in everything. Think about it. If we get rid of truth in math and we just make it conceptualized, well, I think about 2 plus 2. And I know how to get, if I write a 2 and then I put a plus, then I get a 2, then that's the way I do the equation. Well, if we get rid of truth, basic truth from math, we've basically gotten rid of truth in everything. Something to think about. Academic math versus transformational math. Here's transformational math. Well, the curriculum de-emphasizes procedural knowledge drills in favor of technology. We're more interested in calculators and computers. Lessons may include more exploratory material, supportive of conceptual understanding, rather than direct presentations of facts and methods. Emphasis may be on practical applications and greater issues such as the environment, gender issues, and racial diversity and social justice. Well, here we are inside our Common Core Mathematics book again, and I would like to point out that there is an entire chapter on social justice math. It's absolutely true. This particular all these little boxes here are talking about how we need to divide children up into little groups because we know that this group doesn't perform as well in math, and so if we divide them up into groups, then what? Well, then they're easier to pick at one another. So we divide people up into groups to conquer them. We don't divide them up into groups to help them. If you remember, we are a soup in America. We are a melting pot. We were supposed to be many different ethnicities and nations coming here for what America could provide for our families and for the families, not because we came over here to be an Italian American or a black American, because we came here to be an American. So the more that we use schooling to divide children up into groups, the more that we're going to be conquered by those that do that. Because remember, united we stand and divided we fall. If you divide people up and you get them to fighting one another, they are easily conquered people. So the whole idea of justice and social justice in math and in schools is absolutely incorrect and divisive, not bringing together. And this is exactly what this talks about basically here. Respond to equity is a meaningful process to address social justice issues of race, language, gender, and class bias. And it goes on and on and on and on. This is not anything that should be in our schools. We should be promoting unity. We should not be promoting social justice, and this class is better or worse than that class. We're all one people. We were all created by God to be individuals. We are not to be divided into groups. All right, what else? Well, mathematics lessons may include writing, drawing, games, instructions with manipulatives rather than filling out worksheets. Lessons may include exploration of concepts. Grading may be based on demonstration of conceptual understanding rather than entirely on whether the final answer is correct. It sounds absolutely ridiculous, but again, if we go back to our Common Core math book, basically that is exactly what they tell you in this Common Core math book. They say, this will be critical during initial planning and especially after analyzing student learning in order to increase the cognitive demand and effectiveness of the selected instructional tasks. How the mathematics content is approached to engage students in doing mathematics as articulated in the mathematical practices, Common Core mathematical practices, is as important, if not more important, than what is taught. Well, this sounds silly, so that can't be really true. Well, let's look at this video coming up here next. This woman's name is Amanda August. She is with a school in Grace Lake, Illinois. She's actually the curriculum director, I guess, of this area, explaining the focus of Common Core Math to a group of parents at a Common Core Math town hall meeting. Let's listen to what she says.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the
going to be correcting them.
Oh, absolutely, right? Absolutely. We want our students to compute correctly, but the emphasis is really moving more towards the explanation and the how and the why, and can I really talk through the procedures that I went through to get this answer, and not just knowing that it's 12, but why is it 12? How do I know that?
Yes, she did just echo exactly what we read out of the textbook. There just was not a lot of difference to that, was there? That's, it's absolutely mind-boggling, I think, that we're hearing this come up. This has come up before in history, and we're replaying it again. It's like regifting. We take old, worn-out, failed educational methods, such as outcome-based education, school to work, and then all we do is change their name, put them in a new box, put a little new wrapping paper on them, and send them off again to be opened by some yet other unsuspecting school or state. It's quite silly. Well, where does this nonsense come from? Well, if you'll look on this page, you'll see an actual screenshot of the Common Core State Standards website right there. And you'll see that it says Mathematics Standards for Mathematical Practice. And you did hear you did see in the book, the Common Core Mathematics book, as I was reading along, and it talked about the mathematical practices. They were getting this from the mathematical practices. Well, I wanted to see what that was. So I went to the Common Core website and I looked up the mathematical standards, and you can see that how you get to it. It says it right here. You just click on Standards for Mathematical Practice. And I read through this part, and it talks about how they came up with these standards, and it talks about the first part of these standards are process standards, problem solving, reasoning, improved communication, representation, connections. Now it says the second are the strands of mathematical proficiency specified in the National Research Council's report, Adding It Up. And here are what those are: adaptive reasoning, strategic competence, conceptual understanding, didn't we just talk about that? Comprehension of mathematical concepts, operations, and relations, procedural fluency, and that's important, carrying out procedures flexibly, accurately, efficiently, and appropriately, and productive disposition, unbelievable, habitual inclination to see mathematics as sensible, useful, and worthwhile, coupled with a belief in diligence and one's own efficacy. How ridiculous. I can't even read it with a straight voice. It's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And I thought, what in the world are they talking about here? So I went to the National Research Council's report on Adding It Up. Well, guess what I found out there? I found out that basically this is done by the national academies, and the national academies contain the National Academy of Science and the National Academy of History, and a number of different things are housed together under the national academies. You can just Google it, the national academies. Well, I couldn't figure out, I decided, well, I looked it up on the National Academy's website, and I looked through, it's a very huge document, it's 474 pages. And obviously I didn't have time to read 474 pages, but I read through a number of different things. And one of the things that you always want to do when you read a scientific paper of any kind, or any kind of a scholarly paper, is to go to the end and look at the conclusions and recommendations, because that gives you an idea much better than the abstract at the front, which doesn't contain a lot of information. Tells you what the conclusion that they've come to at the end, and then you can go back and study particular parts that you're most interested in. Well, I went to the conclusions and recommendations, and I was absolutely shocked. And I'm going to read almost this entire paragraph for you. To many people, and hopefully I can do it with a straight voice, to many people, school mathematics is virtually a phenomenon of nature. It seems timeless, set in stone, hard to change. I don't know if they're Cockney or hard to change, but they actually spelled it, the National Academy of whatever, spelled it as ARD, hard to change, and perhaps not needing to change. But the school mathematics education of yesterday, which had a practical basis, is no longer viable. Oh yes, people, they just said that basic math is no longer viable. It's not practical. Who needs it? Rote learning of arithmetic procedures no longer has the clear value it once had. And I guess it's scholarly because they say arithmetic. That's not normally used in, common sense. Did you do your arithmetic averages today? That's just, so there we go. It's very scholarly. So they're telling you in a very scholarly fashion that learning math facts has no clear value. It's just simply obsolete. The widespread availability of technological tools for computation means that people are less dependent on their own powers of computation. Isn't that what we just read? Did we not just read that under outcomes-based education? Is how we just go, we don't need the basic stuff. We don't need any of that because we'll just look it up on the computer or do a calculator for it. That's outcome-based education, absolutely, without a question. So they go on. At the same time, people are much more exposed to numbers and quantitative ideas, and so need to deal with mathematics on a higher level than they did just 20 years ago. Holy cow, have you ever heard such a load of tripe in your entire life? This is the Common Core, people. This is Common Core math. This is what your kids are going to get in school under Common Core math. Very, very, very upsetting. Well, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, where is this coming from? Because if you look at any of the Common Core state standards in any great depth, it's all a circle. It's an echo chamber. CCCS gets their money from Bill Gates, who does this, and all it just goes around in a circle. So I thought, I'm wondering where the national academies get their money, and has Bill Gates given them any money for the Common Core state standards, for pushing out the Common Core state standards? Oh my goodness. Well, wouldn't you look at that? Again, I love Bill and Melinda Gates' website. They tell you exactly who they give the money to. It's very easy to look it up and check that out. I suggest that you do just that. If you search, and I put National Academies Common Core, and it came up with approximately $10.6 million donated by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to the National Academies to push out Common Core state standards. So here's what you have. Makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know. Let's see if you can follow me. So I'm Bill Gates. I have a computer industry. I push out software. I make computers. I make software for computers. I make software for all kinds of things that run on all kinds of different platforms. Well, if people can actually do a lot of stuff on their own, I don't sell a whole lot of computer programs, do I? But if people are becoming dumber and dumber and they can't do things on their own, because instead I want to train them, and I want to get teachers to train them into becoming dependent on my computer or my program, my software for addition or calculations, then boy, I can sure stay in business, can't I? I just make more and more money. So think about that. How does that work? So do you really think that Bill Gates doesn't have anything to gain out of reshaping education to make us all dumber and actually pushing out the idea that we don't need mathematics anymore? We don't need we don't need to have to memorize math facts anymore, because we'll just use a computer for those. I want you to really think about that, because that is absolutely something to think about. So in closing out, academic reading, there's a difference between academic reading and transformational reading. Academic reading is based on phonics. I think most people know what phonics is. It's the study of the actual sound of the language, and you teach kids what sounds the letters make together, and that's, for example, we have a paper right here, so shower, shut, dish, shape. We're teaching them how to read by phonics, by the sound that the letters make. Well, that's in great stark relief to transformational reading, which is done in whole language. And if you'll see here, I've just put a few cards up that teachers use to demonstrate whole language. So what you would have is, here is a piece of fabric, and you look at the word underneath and it says fabric. So we're supposed to memorize that this word fabric, this word F-A-B-R-I-C, matches with fabric. We have no idea what the letters actually say here. We just know that this, whatever this looks like, is fabric. It's important to let you know that Oklahoma has a law that prevents whole language reading instruction. Oklahoma schools are only allowed to teach phonics by state law. So if your kids come home with these crazy cards or a book where they're supposed to be reading by pictures, you immediately send that back to the classroom and tell your teacher that exactly what I just told you, that there is a law against whole word language reading, that it's phonics. Every reading class is supposed to be developed upon and based on phonics, and tell her that, tell he or she that's not acceptable. All right, in closing up here, let's look at the educational theory of Karl Marx. Well, why would we do that? Well, we've talked about what outcome-based education is, and we've shown that basically Common Core state standards are outcome-based education. So where does outcome-based education come from? Where does this all kind of go back to? Well, let's look at the theory of Karl Marx. What did he say? A change of social circumstances was required to establish a proper system of education. On the other hand, a proper system of education was required to bring about a change of social circumstances. So didn't we say that the progressive education is to transform society? It's not so much about knowledge, but transform society. So where did that come from? It combines education with industrial production. Well, what are we doing right now? Everything is about funneling kids into the workforce. We need to educate them for the workforce. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from Marxism. It comes from what Karl Marx and the communists believed about education. Well, why? Well, you've heard a lot, I'm sure, the term human capital. They use that grossly. It's grossly misused, but they use it frequently, these education reformers, educrats, as I think we like to call them. They will call kids human capital. Well, what was human capital under the communist system or the Marxist system? Well, what it was workers didn't have a lot of money, but they did have the power of their own bodies, and they could use the power of their own bodies to parlay that into money for themselves or standing in the community, whatever that might be. But they used their own power to be able to make a place for themselves. That's human capital. We don't have human capital in America. We simply do not. We have, and we never should, we have children who will collect knowledge to become brighter kids than hopefully even their parents were, and go on to make great things of themselves based on knowledge, classically obtained knowledge. The Marxists believed that education is constructivist in nature, where meaning is constructed by the subject out of material provided by the external world. So if you walked out and you didn't like something, you based a lot of what you thought about that. You weren't interested in reading history books or disseminating facts or learning about facts. It was all about what was going on in the now. And in that point, it emphasizes social, historical, and collaborative character of human activity, because we need to create social change, and we do that by banding together as a social, one social animal, as it were, because that's the only way that we force change. The communists seek to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. Well, how do you do that? Well, you put everybody on one standard, because then that way you chop off the ends of the bell curve. No, you don't have anybody on the low end, but you certainly don't have anybody on the high end who could somehow become part of the ruling class. Well, contrast that to the educational theory of Thomas Jefferson? Well, he believed that knowledge was obtained by the study of classic literature, languages, and history. If we don't learn about history, we are doomed to repeat history. And the communists never understood that because they were more interested in the here and now and what was going on and changing their communities and their social structure now. And so because of that, they were never able to learn the histories of the past, and communism fails every time. We must be educated in the history of our past. It's the only way that we can continue and be able to learn and not make those same mistakes. They believed that literacy was most important for citizenship and self-government. If you can't read, then there's no possible way that you can be an active member of society. And it's interesting, too, when you think about it, you think about Madison and Jay writing the Federalist Papers, for example. Well, they didn't write those for academics. They wrote those for farmers, for them to understand why we needed a constitution and why we needed to be a republic. You look at the Federalist Papers now and try to read those things. You think that they didn't have better education way back in the old people days, way back when they had horses and buggies, and I've heard people say, you want to drag us back into the Dark Ages. Well, you know what? I'd love to go back to the Dark Ages if I could read and really understand information like basic farmers did under the Federalist Papers. I mean, who wouldn't want that? That's just silly. They believe that all men are created equal. Again, we don't divide them up into social justice groupings so that we can determine what group is and isn't being served. We're all created equal by a God that created us all equal. We should act in that form. The children should be educated to instill traits of self-discipline, self-government, and self-efficacy, because they are individuals and they are created as an individual by their creator. Fact-based knowledge from books rather than actual experiences were more important in obtaining knowledge, and we talked about that. Well, let's close out by looking at this last slide, and this is a very interesting slide. I actually got this it comes from the book The Burden by Jamie Vollmer, and basically this person has listed she says, okay, we used to teach basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. Well, why? To cultivate values that serve a democratic society. That's exactly what the founders wanted. Well, even as early as 1900, we were adding nutrition and immunization to the list of school responsibilities, to the point that when you get up into the 1980s, you're talking about everything from global education, ethnic, multicultural, non-sexist education, full-day kindergarten, stranger danger education, HIV, AIDS, death education, bus safety education, bicycle safety education. The more that we put in schools to teach kids, the less we're teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic. The more stuff that we're taking over for the family, the less we're forcing the family to take over and do that for themselves. So the greater dependent society we create, because parents aren't able to do this at home. They're expecting the kids to get it at school, so they simply don't educate them for that. That is not in any way, shape, or form the way that the founders intended for education in this constitutional republic to be. So I hope you've learned something from this program that we've put together on outcome-based education. I hope that when you see some of the things, or if you see some, I hope you never see anything that we put into this program. However, if you do, I hope that you are able to believe that you can confront your teachers and be able to stand up for your children and put what's right back in the classroom and help your children and all other children to be educated for knowledge and not for the workforce.